Historian Bill Waiser lives in Saskatoon. He is the author of A World We Have Lost, Saskatchewan Before 1905, winner of the 2016 Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction. He's also the recipient of the 2018 Governor General's History Award for Popular Media, the Pierre Berton Award. You're not too kind to Pierre in the book.
No, I'm not too kind to Pierre Berton in the Almighty Voice book because Pierre repeats a myth about Almighty Voice that has been repeated many times before and many times since. And Almighty Voice, the book attempts to establish or separate fact from fiction in telling this indigenous story.
Yes, the book is In Search of Almighty Voice, Resistance and Reconciliation, published by Fifth House. There's a lot on his resistance, but not too much on reconciliation in this book, save for the last line, which is there can be no reconciliation without memory. So what do you mean by that?
What I argue in Search of Almighty Voice is that the popular story misses the true import of what happened to Almighty Voice. And for your listeners, in 1895, he was arrested for killing a cow, brought to the Duck Lake Barracks. He escaped during the night. He fled to his parents' home and then realized he couldn't stay there, that the Mounties would come and find him. So he fled to the Carrot River country, which was east of his home reserve, the One Arrow First Nation. And he was tracked by a Mountie, and he told the Mountie to leave him alone, that he did not want to go back to One Arrow, that he would refuse to surrender to the policeman. The policeman refused to believe him and continued to advance, and Almighty Voice shot him. He killed him. And thereafter, Almighty Voice was one of the most wanted criminals in Canada for the next 19 months. The trigger to that incident, though, Nigel, is that the common story is that the evening that Almighty Voice was sitting in the Duck Lake Barracks, his jailer joked that he was going to be hanged. And that triggered the entire episode. From that point forward, that was Almighty Voice's fear, and that's why he fled. That's why he killed the Mountie. And First Nations have lived with that shame ever since. And I know I spoke to the Saskatchewan Tribal Assembly about 2 years ago, and I talked about the Almighty Voice story and the common story, the popular story, and what really happened. And what really happened is that Almighty Voice had indeed killed a cow, but it wasn't a government cow, it was a settler's cow. It was in the spring of 95. He's not arrested to the fall of October 1995. And he's arrested in October 1995 because the Indian agent is tired of the resistance of people like Almighty Voice and his family to government policies. Okay. And Almighty was arrested for that, but what's not known at the time, and what I since discovered by going through the police documents and the Indian Affairs documents, is that he had once threatened to kill the Indian agent. And at the time, in 1895, Indian agents doubled as justices of the peace. So Almighty Voice is about to come before the very man he once threatened. That's why he ran, not because of some bogus hanging threat.
Right. Okay.
I said, what I was told at the Saskatchewan Tribal Council, one of the former chiefs said to me that our people have been embarrassed for the past 100 years because of this so-called hanging story. But you have presented another explanation that makes perfect sense. Because if you look at reserve life for First Nations in the 1890s, they couldn't leave their reserve without a pass. They are restricted. They're essentially prisoners on their own reserves. They couldn't use machinery to work their fields. The Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, Hayter Reid, believed in what he called a peasant farming policy. They had to work with hand tools and work their way up to mechanized equipment. And so they're working their fields with hand tools. They couldn't sell their products without a permit. And if they refused to cooperate, their rations were restricted.
One of the main reasons given is that he was hungry. He wanted to feed his family. That's why he killed the cow.
That's right. He's hungry. They're starving. These people are starving.
Yeah.
In fact, in the right after the 1885 Northwest Resistance, Indian Affairs Department wanted to amalgamate several reserves, including One Arrow. And when the One Arrow people refused to move, they stopped feeding them.
You're right.
They tried to starve them into submission. So when I write about resistance and reconciliation, we need to understand why he resisted, and only by understanding why he resisted that memory can we move forward with reconciliation.
Okay. So your job as a historian is to figure out why he resisted.
In part, yes, that's part of my job, but I actually think I've got a bigger job. I have read the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner. Senator Murray Sinclair talked about reconciliation, and this is a paraphrase. He says it's not an Aboriginal problem, it's a Canadian problem. It involves all of us. So as an historian, I see my job as going back, reinterrogating the literature, looking at it from different perspectives. I also worked with the One Arrow First Nation. I actually met with a descendant of Almighty Voice, Peter Almighty Voice, and this was arranged with the chief. And I presented him with my tobacco. I explained what I was doing, and I needed family permission to pursue this project if I was going to work with the band. He said it was a good idea. I then met with the elders and talked to them about the project and what I was seeking to do. I met with the band council, I met with the chief, I met with the tribal council. So all along the way, I've been involving, or I should more correctly, working with the One Arrow First Nation to ensure that the indigenous perspective came through in this story. And I combine that by going back and looking at the original police documents and the original Indian Affairs documents. So I tried to come at it from a comprehensive point of view, but also keeping in mind the many perspectives that are part of this story.
What this is an entirely indigenous view of what happened, if you ask me.
In part, but what I think I found by going back and looking at the Indian Affairs and Mounted Police documents is that I found an explanation for indigenous behavior. Indigenous people at the time were regarded as lazy and indolent because they wouldn't do what they were told to do, not because they were necessary, lazy and indolent. And
that's,
so
you know what? That's a normal human reaction. Don't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
That's normal.
Yeah. And so by looking at these police and Indian Affairs documents, I came up with the interpretation I offer in Almighty Voice for what really happened.
Yeah.
To suggest that Almighty Voice, this young man, would be naive enough to believe he would be hanged for killing a cow plays into standard interpretations about Indian people at the time. And I use Indian people, the term at the time. They're gullible. They're easily tricked. They're naive. And people have accepted that. He wasn't gullible. He wasn't naive. He knew he wouldn't be hanged for killing a cow, but he damn well knew that he didn't want to come before the Indian agent he had once threatened.
He knew he wouldn't get a fair shake.
That's right. And that's why he ran. And then the other complication of this story was looking at how it's been told since the 1890s. And that's when I came upon the work of Chief Buffalo Longlands.
We'll get to that. But yeah, what you do in basically the first half of the book, you lay out your interpretation of what happened. And it's very much, as I say, the indigenous view of what happened, I think. So my question is, how do you know what happened when Almighty Voice was approached by that Mountie and the Mountie was shot?
In October of 1895 in the Carrot River country, what we have are two eyewitness accounts. We have the eyewitness account of Francis Dumont, who was the scout for Colebrook, and we have the eyewitness account of Smallface, who was with Almighty Voice at the time. Those two individuals were interrogated with translators by the Northwest Mounted Police. And in fact, Smallface was interrogated a couple of times. So I have the transcripts of what happened in that showdown. They recalled the conversation, they recall what Almighty Voice said to the Mountie, leave me alone, back away, just leave me. He more or less tells him, leave me alone and everything will be fine. And the other thing that I found in looking at those transcripts is that when Colebrook was found, the police that went to retrieve Colebrook's body found him sprawled on the ground with a revolver nearby the body. And in the transcripts, they talk about how Colebrook rode forward with one hand in his coat and his one hand raised. So yes, he was calling on Almighty Voice to surrender, but in case there was a problem, he was ready to pull out a revolver.
Okay. So the argument is this was not cold-blooded murder.
It is a murder. He does kill them. There's no doubt about it. And Almighty Voice did warn him, and the Mountie foolishly rode forward. He could have withdrawn. He could have got reinforcements. You know, he knew where the Almighty Voice was, but he believed he could bring him in almost single-handedly because the scout actually watches the Mountie ride forward. What you've got to realize by that point is that, yes, there was this initially good relationship between Mounties and First Nations in the 1870s into the 1880s. But in the 1890s, the Mounted Police are used as enforcers for Indian Affairs policy, and they didn't like it, but they were asked to do it. And so there is a widening divide between Mounties and First Nations because they have become enforcers. In fact, one senior Mountie, a superintendent, more or less says that the Cree have come to fear us because we are the men that go to arrest them. So that bond is broken down by the 1890s as well.
So again, you've told me that you consulted transcripts.
Yes.
What else did you do to get what you think is the accurate version of what happened?
Okay, I went back and I gathered all the Northwest Mounted Police documents on the incident. And because more than one policeman was killed, there were actually 3 Mountie deaths. There are voluminous records on this incident, voluminous records. I must have 3 banker boxes full of documents. So that's not only police documents, but one of the most documented people in Canada in the 19th century were First Nations. The Indian Affairs Department kept records on everything, all kinds of data, all kinds of records. So I went back and collected those records as well. Not only records held by the Indian Affairs Department in Ottawa, but records held by the Indian Affairs agencies in Saskatchewan. So I collected as many official documents as I could. And as I said, it's quite a voluminous collection.
Where did you get those?
Many of them in Ottawa. I found them in other archives across Western Canada. I found, for example, the patrol records of the Mounties that were sent out to search for Almighty Voice. They looked for him for 19 months. Every Mountie patrol out there kept records of where they went, who they interviewed. They were part of the RCMP depot in Regina.
Okay. What else did you do?
Besides collecting those documents for the first part of the story?
For your version.
For my version, I also collected oral histories that have been collected prior to my arrival on the scene tackling this story. So there was an oral history interview collected in the 1920s with the parents of Almighty Voice. And then there was an oral history interview collected in the 1940s with a brother of Almighty Voice. The interview with the parents was held in the Glenbow Archives in Calgary, and the interview with the brother was actually published in a police document. I also talked to elders. Yeah. What is the story within the community? What stories did your parents or your grandparents tell you about this incident? So I worked with the One Arrow First Nation community as well. And I wasn't after, the important thing was after historical information, not sacred information. And I listened and I learned, Nigel. You don't simply show up with a tape recorder and say, tell me your story.
You were humble.
No, you have to be, it's not my first rodeo, as we like to say in Western Canada. I've been working with First Nations communities for over 25, 30 years, going back to the mid-1990s, and I've tackled other projects. You have to build trust, you have to be patient, and you have to be prepared to listen and learn. And I was actually interviewed by Chief Tricia Sutherland of the One Arrow First Nation before I met family members, because she wanted to know, what the hell do you want to do with my people? Why do you want to come to the One Arrow community? What exactly are you after? And these are legitimate concerns. So I like to say we had a conversation. It was more like an interview. And after about 45 minutes, and she looked at my work, she said, the place to start is with the family. And she's ensured that proper protocol was followed all the way along. And I brought my tobacco, and many of the meetings were begun with prayers, indigenous prayers, and ended with prayers. But one of the most gratifying experiences I had was a round table in the One Arrow community, where we sat in a circle, and then everybody sat, anybody else who arrived, and this went on all afternoon, would come out in the second row or the third row of the circle. We talked for several hours, sharing information. At the end, we all shook hands with one another and talked about the need to share information. I knew things that they may not have known, and they knew things that I might have known. One thing that I did know about, and I talk about in the first part of the story, is that when Almighty Voice was killed in May of 1897, your listeners will want to know that he was killed by a cannon blast, a 7-pounder and a 9-pounder, and they literally blew him up. The top of his head was blown off. He died.
Yeah, they kept that as a trophy.
A trophy. And what the band didn't know is that that top of his skull was on display in the old RCMP Depot Museum.
Right.
I took that information to the band. I could have made a big splash about that, Nigel. I could have gone to the press, said, this is what I found during this book. No. I went back to the band. I spoke to the chief. She was very upset. I remember when I first spoke to her over lunch, I said, I need to talk to you. I told her what I had found. I showed her the documentation. She was very upset. She says, we have to wait for the right time to tell the elders. But a couple of months later, I went to the One Arrow First Nation. I met with the elders and I told them. And they spoke a lot in Cree. And unfortunately, I don't understand Cree. And they said, and I was translated for me, the white man has brought us this story, and we're appreciative of that. But it was the white man that did this to Almighty Voice, and we have to decide what to do. And I said, yes, that's why I'm here, simply to tell you what I know. The band will have to decide. And since then, the band has made a formal request to the RCMP for the return of One Arrow, Almighty Voice's remains, so that they can have a proper burial.
Well, what do they have? Just his scalp or what?
The skull fragment. The top of his head was blown off. They have the skull fragment. Okay.
It's fairly obvious, but did they explain exactly why they're so upset?
Well, if you had a family member that died under those circumstances and they took away part of your skull and put it on display for several decades, I think you might be upset. Mm-hmm. It's an indignity.
Right.
And so let's correct that indignity. That's part of the reconciliation process as well.
Okay. So that's why you wrote this book?
I've written a few books, Nigel, and I like to tackle topics that I like to reinvestigate topics. So to give you an example, I did a book on the 1935 Ottawa Trek and Regina riot. There have been 2 books written about that event, but what I was able to do is that by the time I came around to write that book, the access to information legislation existed. So whereas previous authors didn't have access to that legislation, I used it to get previously closed government records. And the standard story about the Ottawa Trek and riot is that a policeman was killed during the July Dominion Day riot of 1935. I discovered that there was a second death. One of the trekkers was killed that night, and his death was covered up by the Mounted Police. I've also looked at how the national parks in Western Canada were built with internment labor. During the First and Second World Wars and during the 1930s, people were interned in Western Canada's national parks. those people that were interned in Western Canada's national parks, enemy aliens during the First World War, relief workers during the 1930s, conscientious objectors, Japanese Canadians, and German prisoners of war in the Second World War. They were used to build Western Canada's national parks. So the wonderful facilities, the roads, the buildings that we enjoy today were built by an internment labor. And to get back to Almighty Voice,
Slave labor.
I didn't like the standard story that this young man would do all that because somebody had joked he would be hanged. That doesn't quite make sense because he's not an idiot. He's not stupid. In fact, Pierre Berton says that in his coverage of it. He wasn't stupid. There had to be some other explanation. Okay. And that other explanation is that threat to the Indian agent, and it all spirals out of control.
So it's a combination of there's a mystery and there's a question. Something doesn't quite ring true. You think that's not the truth.
And if history was just one damn fact after another, Nigel, I wouldn't be an historian. Right. History is about change over time. Thankfully, historians get access to new records. I'll give you one other example, and I'm going to put you on the spot, Nigel.
Go for it.
Who was our longest serving Indian Affairs minister in Canadian history? I'll let you off the hook. John A. Macdonald. Our first prime minister was also our longest serving Indian Affairs minister. He wore two hats.
Right.
And one of the wonderful sources of material on First Nations in the 1880s are the papers of John A. Macdonald. If you look at Donald Creighton's book, which won a Governor General's Literary Award about Macdonald,
you will 2 volumes. I read it.
2 volumes, but look at the index. You will not find much about Indians, First Nations, or Natives in his index.
Right.
And yet, best sources for information about First Nation in the 1880s and policy are the Macdonald papers. And I used that information with my colleague, Blair Stonechild, a Cree scholar, and we did a book in the 1990s that looked at the First Nations' role in the 1885 Northwest resistance. And a lot of that material came from Macdonald's papers. So again, history is about change over time, but also history is about access to new sources and retelling stories. It doesn't stand still.
And hopefully you agree that history isn't about canceling things.
I'm a great believer that we cannot be involved in presentism, taking current values and applying to the past. What I do is I try and explain why they behaved or acted in the way they did at the time. And if you're going to damn John A. Macdonald for his actions in the 1880s, you're going to have to damn or censure several generations of Canadians because of their attitudes at the time.
Wow, Laurier.
In fact, that's my new project, Nigel. It's the new book is, in fact, I'm halfway done now. It's called Inferno. And that term comes from a phrase that Robert Borden used in the House of Commons, but under the Laurier government, 21% of the land was taken from prairie reserves, 21%. Yeah. Government civil servants bought that land. In fact, 3 civil servants made the equivalent of $2 million in today's dollars. And an Ottawa cleaning lady bought 3/4 sections of Indian land under suspicious circumstances. So that's what I'm looking at.
Okay, let's look at how you wrote it. You wrote that first half of the book. Well, it's full of suspense. It kept me turning the pages.
Good.
I knew he was going to meet his demise, but I wasn't quite sure how.
Good. It was deliberately written that way. I'm a great believer in the power of story, and the Almighty Voice story is a powerful one based on the facts.
Right.
I wanted to engage the reader and inform the reader. So I suspect you learned a fair bit about Indian Affairs policy at the time, learned about Indigenous lives at the time. And I that's the backdrop, but I wanted to tell this human interest story about this young man who was frustrated with his dead-end future and came up against these Mounties that wanted to bring them back to the reserve and ensure they stayed there. I tried to write it as a dramatic story because it is a dramatic story. I'm a great believer that there shouldn't be a dividing line between academic and popular history. I think that dividing line should be between good and bad history, and I tried to write an engaging story. Before I left U of S a few years ago, I actually introduced a graduate course on how to write history and other nonfiction, because I believe that graduate students in history and other disciplines at the university had trouble writing engaging, accessible prose. And to me, it doesn't make sense to do all this wonderful research and not be able to communicate it clearly and effectively.
Absolutely right on. I was going to say that the dividing line should be between also good writing and bad writing.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so what's the takeaway from that course that you taught?
Well, the takeaway from the course that I taught is that students came in to that course, graduate students, thinking that they knew how to write.
No, I want to know exactly how.
What do you mean?
I want to get some of the nuggets from the actual teaching that you did. I know they wanted to go in there and write better. How?
What I did was I first of all had them come to the class with an example of what they thought was good writing. Let's start there.
Okay.
And that was very revealing what they regarded as good writing. And then they had to explain their thesis in 300 words, clear 300 words, and develop an overarching argument, describe a setting or scene. They had to describe a character. They had to describe action. They had to learn how to use quotations.
No. I want to know what the secret is, Bill.
What's the secret to good writing is?
So maybe you could point to what you think is the best history writing you've ever read.
It has to transport you to the time and place. You have to have a sense that you're there, that you can see it, you can smell it, you can taste it, you can hear it. And in fact, that writing is so powerful that it almost haunts you. It gets into your head. I find that myself when I'm doing a writing project, I'm back there.
So what's the greatest history writing you've ever read?
I admire my friend Guy Vanderhaeg's, his historical fiction. And I admire his work because of his attention to everyday details.
Okay. It's
just phenomenal what Guy can do. I also admire the work of Doris Kearns, who did a book called No Ordinary Time, looking at the Roosevelts in the White House. I am also a believer, Nigel, that as a historian, I can learn many things from fiction writing.
Well, exactly. That was suspense in the first half of the book. Anything else that you tried to do in that first half of the book?
Well, you hit it on the head during the first part of our conversation today, Nigel, is that I wanted to make sure that the First Nations perspective came through. Okay. And from your comments today, I succeeded there. Up to now, the Almighty Voice story has been told by the non-Native, non-Indigenous point of view.
Okay. Now, you're not Native, of course.
I'm not.
Has that come up at all?
No, it has not come up. And I said, I've worked with Indigenous communities over 25 years. So as I said, you need to come with respect, a willingness to listen and to learn and to be patient. I did a book in the 1990s with Blair Stonechild on the 1885 Northwest Resistance. I also worked for the Beardies First Nation on an annuities claim. I was asked by the longest, or up until a few years ago, the longest serving chief in Saskatchewan from the Okanese First Nation, Marie Daywalker, to work with her elders and bring students together. And then I've done this work with One Arrow. So I don't think you can do Canadian history or in particular Saskatchewan history without doing Indigenous history. It's impossible. It's a big part of the story.
Okay, then, so starting at chapter 4, you start looking chronologically at all the people and the histories that got it wrong, in your opinion.
Or abused it or used it for their own purpose. Yes.
Yeah, in other words, it seems to me what you're saying is that history is a series of distortions and lies.
It can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. What I'm arguing in Search of Almighty Voice, that he did not really die in May of 1897. His story continued, and he continued to be re-examined, reinvented, used, or abused. And who he might have been almost became more important than who he was in the hands of writers after 1897. They used him for various purposes. The first group of authors were Mountie authors, and they reinforced that here's an example of why Mounties should be revered and respected because they uphold the law.
Well, and they always get their man.
They always get their man. And Almighty Voice was a terrible criminal, and he caused the death of 3 Mounties, but in the end, we got him. Law and order prevailed. That's the message.
Yeah. So in other words, you settlers, you're going to be safe.
That's right. And a lot of Canadians don't realize that, is that there was still this fear of First Nations people in the 1890s, 1900s. They can't be trusted. Yeah. They won't fit in. They're going to hold back Western Canada, the great future that we have. And this fear comes through in how that story is told. When Almighty Voice is on the run, people are afraid he may show up in our community. What's going to happen to us? Because there's that underlying fear of First Nations at the time.
Well, yeah, like you summon up the term on the war path, and this fear of an uprising.
That's right. And those are not my words, but those are the words that were used at the time, on the war path. And so you can imagine, in your imagination, you can think what that conjures up about Almighty Voice. So that's how he's initially portrayed after the incident.
Well, yeah, and these are savages who are dangerous.
That's right. And he got what he deserved. He got what he deserved. It's unfortunate that some men had to die, but in the long run, we did get our man. And in fact, as I suggest, there's symbolic importance, the fact that he was killed on a Sunday morning. And one writer equates the firing of the cannon to the ringing of church bells that morning, the symbolic importance of that.
Yeah, you do a good job of making it kind of sickening, because basically they pull in like 100 Mounties just to blow a very small handful of Indians, and yet they go strutting around saying they've done a great, look what we've done.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you do a good job of that.
Thank you.
Again, but what you're doing is, it seems to me, trying to recruit Canadians for the side of Indigenous people here.
Not necessarily recruit them, but I'm trying to force Canadians, well, this is only one side, and it's a blinker side of the story. You're not getting a full and complete understanding of what was going on and what was happening.
Right. I think the message is, history is complex and complicated. And
messy at times too. It can be very messy. And that's where Chief Buffalo Longlands comes into this story. He makes a real muck of it, Nigel. And ever since then, we have been living with the consequences of that.
Yeah, one thing, when I read that, I thought, what's with these white guys pretending to be Indians?
Well, he wasn't alone. First of all, there was Grail.
That's what I mean. What's with all of these guys doing this? What is that?
But in Chief Buffalo Longlands' case, he really isn't white. He is indigenous, he's black, and he's white. He's actually Sylvester Long from the United States, but he assumes a Blackfoot identity.
Right.
In the 1920s, he comes to Canada, assumes a Blackfoot identity, and he starts writing Blackfoot stories that he says are his own, when in fact they're stories he's collected in his role as a reporter. He's a reporter. And he shows up at the One Arrow First Nation to talk to Almighty Voice's parents. And they speak to him. And I found the transcript of that interview. I found it in the Glenbow Archives in Calgary. And it's in his handwriting, very jot notes. But it's at the end of the interview, after he's talked to the parents, you can see him starting to formulate the story in his head. He is first and foremost a writer looking for a good story. And what that means for Chief Buffalo Longlance is that if he has to stretch the truth or distort the truth, he's going to do it. So he's the one who comes up with the idea, oh, Almighty Voice was threatened with hanging. That's what happened. What he was in fact told during that interview is that Almighty Voice feared hanging after he had killed Colebrook. He knew he faced execution for killing a Mountie. This was after. But Longlance says the Mountie in the jail said he was going to be hanged, and this reciprocates everything. Almighty Voice also has 1,000 people at the bluff, which is 10 times the number of people that were there. Yeah. Almighty Voice also has him escaping the Duck Lake Barracks by jumping over a fence. Well, I've seen a picture of the Duck Lake Barracks. There's no fence. This is all made up. Almighty Voice said he's chained to a ball and chain, a huge ball that's tethered to the ground. I've seen the Mountie report. The reason the Mounties were in trouble when Almighty Voice escaped is because he's lying in the cot in the corner, not even handcuffed. So all of this is made up. It's all made up to sell stories and to advance Longlance's name. But people have picked up on that, and they've used it, and they've expanded upon it, and it's been accepted ever since. And if I can be blunt with your listeners, it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. But it does sell stories. That story is front page news on Sunday newspapers across North America. And people read it. And they believe that because he spoke to Almighty Voice's parents, they must have told him the truth, not realizing that he was an imposter. Almighty Voice's parents didn't realize he was an imposter.
And as a result, he's in the limelight.
He's in the limelight, and before he can recant the story, he's found out in the late 1920s. Kills himself. But his story is still out there, still being read, still influencing people.
And so again, the people that follow him, that write their stories, aren't very good fact checkers.
No, they aren't. And in fact, there's the Leonard Peterson play, and then there's the Moses play, Almighty Voice and his wife. If you read their thinking before they did their plays, they both admit that the evidence, the stories they've read about Almighty Voice are all conflicting. They have trouble trying to figure out what exactly happened because there's so much conflicting material out there. I must have read at least 300 pieces on Almighty Voice since 1897. And it's unbelievable. One person claimed that he was actually a religious shaman and that he was part of a religious movement to drive the white man from Western Canada. That was one story. That appeared in a men's magazine. Emily Murphy, in her book, has Almighty Voice not killing a cow, but a sheep. So it's so far-fetched in many of these stories.
Yeah, I mean that obviously we're only going to hold the fact checking in what purports to be journalism. There's also a lot of fiction that's been written about it, right?
That's right, and he's perfect for a fictional writer, and a lot of people take his story and run with it. They add things, they subtract things. But what's quite interesting, it all comes back to Longlance's story and the inventions that he adds, and he's never challenged on it. And people accept it. And as I said, that's the sad part of this story, that they would believe that One Arrow would be so vulnerable, to be so stupid to believe that he would be hanged for killing a cow.
Mighty Voice.
Almighty Voice, pardon me. There are all kinds of incidents regarding cattle in the 1890s. In fact, that's the common crime amongst First Nations in the 1890s because they're starving. It happens across Western Canada. Ranchers are losing a cow here and there. A government cow goes missing. They're hungry. And none of those people were executed.
Right. Again, are you suggesting then that all of these different, quote, histories, the reason that they're distorting the facts or just lazy, just following what's been written before, is that because they want to make their copy more dramatic? Like, what's the reason?
Well, I can't speak for other historians, but I think the problem, if you want to call it a problem, is that you've got the dominance of the long length version, and that unless you went to the Glenbow archives and
Right.
looked at that transcript and you compared that transcript to what he actually wrote, you can see that disconnect. Or unless in my part, I went back and looked at those original documents, and it's raised several times. The Indian agent is afraid for his life after Almighty Voice escapes because he says he once threatened me.
Right.
And so I found that by going back and re-examining those documents. So they're not necessarily lazy. It's a matter of them not knowing and basing their research or their writing on what exists out there. Okay. And you've got to be a careful historian. You've got to check your sources, but it's unfortunate that one story keeps being repeated and has become part of the popular canon.
Why did Almighty Voice threaten the guy in the first place?
I suspect that, and there's not an actual reference to it in the agency diary, but he might have threatened the agent because he refused to provide rations for the family. He might have threatened the agent because Almighty Voice preferred to go off hunting as opposed to working in the fields with a hand tool. It's hard to say what it was, but we do know for sure, based on the existing records, that there was this threat. And if you're a young man, Nigel, and neither you and I are, for the sake of our listeners, if there was any doubt, but if you're a young man at 21, okay?
Oh, yeah.
And you're a crack shot, a great hunter, and that you're being told by a representative of the government, despite what the treaty promises are, hey, you can't leave your reserve. You can't step over that boundary line without my permission. And by the way, you've got to work in the field with hand tools when all the white farmers around you are using machinery, okay? And if you're hungry, by the way, you've got to toe the line if you want rations. I think you might be a little upset.
Fuck you, that's the answer.
Yeah. The wonder of it all, and this is something I raised in the conclusion, Nigel, is that the wonder of it all is that he's the only one, it's the only incident of its kind.
I was going to get to that. Yeah, it's funny. Years ago, I was visiting my brother in the Gaza Strip, and it seemed like every night the Israeli jet fighters buzzed the place.
Yeah.
And I could not believe how docile the population was. And they've got every single reason to be furious and to get up and fight. And yes, so as you say, that just doesn't happen. What explains that?
I think there are several reasons to explain why Almighty Voice is one of a few. First of all, there's the treaty pledge to remain peaceful. And I don't think that treaty pledge is appreciated, but they do vow to remain peaceful. There's also the influence of the elders. The elders would discourage any form of violence, okay? And they do, however, resist passively. There are passive ways of resisting, not doing what they're told, and so being as consequently labeled as lazy or indolent or unprogressive, refusing to send their children away to schools. That's another way of passively resisting. So there's all forms of passive resistance. What makes the Almighty Voice case unique is that his grandfather was arrested after 1885 and sent to Stony Mountain Penitentiary, and he's never seen again. He dies there. So the boy's grandfather dies. His own father is arrested and imprisoned and sent to PA jail just before this incident. And you also have the Indian agent rounding up what he called so-called troublemakers. And what are troublemakers? Those that are resisting in any way. He doesn't want any resistance. So he sees what happens to his grandfather. He sees what happens to his own father, and he doesn't want it to happen to himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not the future he wants. And so that's why I think his case is unique here. But they do resist in other ways.
You know, it's kind of sadly ironic that you would say that the various indigenous groups would be faithful to the treaty when the Canadian government wasn't.
Yes, and it might seem ironic, but it's the pledge they made, and it's how they regard the treaties. The treaties are supposed to be a long-term reciprocal relationship. And I like to equate a treaty to a marriage. When you get married, it's a contract, right? You have the ceremony. But to make a marriage work takes time, takes energy, takes commitment. So that marriage contract doesn't mean that the marriage will necessarily work out. The same thing applies to treaty. The treaty is a contract between the Queen, representing Canada, and the First Nations, and it takes work. And First Nations believe that not only treaties have to be adhered to, but continually renewed. This the spirit of kinship. And so today, First Nations are talking about honoring of the treaties. We made this pledge. We need to honor these treaties, and we need to keep that treaty pledge. In Saskatchewan, in the schools today, there is a unit called We Are All Treaty People. Treaties simply don't apply to Indigenous people. They apply to all people in Saskatchewan because Saskatchewan is covered with treaty land. And we need to think in those terms. It's a long-term reciprocal cooperative relationship. We're all in this together, Nigel.
Yeah, I guess as soon as money gets involved, the treaties went out the window.
I think what happens is with regard to treaties, the federal government in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century tried to interpret treaties as narrowly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you suggest that understanding why Almighty Voice mattered has a direct bearing on reconciliation efforts today. Why is that?
Canadians need to understand what happened to this particular individual. They need to understand why he resisted and the circumstances behind that resistance. This was a young man who saw that Indigenous lives in Western Canada in the late 19th centuries were dead-end lives. This is what had not been promised in the treaties. Reserve life was little better than prison farms, where they had limited independence, limited opportunity, and a lifestyle that bordered on starvation. And we need to understand that, to understand their frustration with the treaty agreement and with their treatment at the hand of the Indian Affairs Department. And by understanding that, I think we can move forward to a better relationship today. That's what happened. We need to understand that. We have to recognize that there are some hard truths about Canadian history, and you have to recognize that first before you can move towards reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it's a problem that we, the settlers, broke our word. We have to accept that and accept that we agreed to deal with them as equals, and yet we treated them like slaves.
To a degree, yes. We need to recognize that Canada has had a racist history, and that this racist history has not only led to a number of challenges that we have today, but also limited opportunities for First Nations. We need to recognize that, and to move forward, we need to work cooperatively together. We've got to stop deciding that we know what is best for Indigenous people, that we can tell them what they need to do. We tried that, and look where it's got us. We need to move down the path of reconciliation side by side, not in separate paths, but side by side, working together towards a common future.
Yeah, okay, but
it's not easy. No,
I was gonna say that it seems to me that on one side you're wanting a portion of the tax base, and on the other side you're going to meet resistance from that.
I can't speak for First Nations, okay? So when I say I want a portion of the tax base, so I don't want to. No, I can't speak for them. But what I can speak to is the fact that in Saskatchewan today, by 2050, it's estimated that maybe as much as half of the population will be indigenous. And if you look at the situation in Saskatchewan today, 2/3 to 3/4 of the people in federal and provincial prisons are indigenous. 1 out of 2 indigenous people live in poverty in this province. They're underemployed. I could go on and on. All I'm saying is that if we're going to have a better future together, we have to find different ways of moving forward.
Okay, one more question, and that is, what percentage of the population do indigenous people make up?
Today?
Yeah.
You'll have to look that up for sure, but I think it's up around in the 20 to 30% range today. Yeah, almost 1/3.
It's significant.
It's significant, yes.
So this part of the conversation we've had, is that exactly what you wanted your book to instigate?
If the book generates a conversation about reconciliation, I would welcome that and I would appreciate that. If the book also provides an understanding and appreciation of what First Nations was like under treaty in the 1890s, I would welcome that as well. And if my book provides another perspective, a deeper understanding of why this young man, Almighty Voice, did what he did, and people come to appreciate, oh, he's not naive, he's not stupid, he wasn't gullible, which is the standard interpretation about, that's one of the tropes about indigenous people amongst settler society. No, he had legitimate grievances, legitimate concerns. I've done my job.
Yeah, he was a human being.
He is a human being, yes, with the same wants and desires of us all. Yeah.
Well, it was a pleasure to read and a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay.
Bill Waiser is a historian who lives in Saskatoon. The book, again, is In Search of Almighty Voice, Resistance and Reconciliation. And you're currently working on a book about
reserve surrenders during the Wilfrid Laurier years. It's tentatively titled Inferno.
Fantastic. Thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Nigel. It was a real pleasure.